It's Really Simple with Simeon and Simone. We put the sim in simple. And we like to try to take some complex things, complex topics, and condense them down to a simplicity so that we can understand things. So, hi, Simone.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Good. I'm great. All right, so today's topic is going to be the Tucker Carlson, Ted Cruz interview, although I would say it was more of a debate and more than anything, really, an ambush, actually. I had to go out to actually Tucker Carlson's YouTube channel to find the title because I couldn't even think of what they might title this episode. They did title it Regime Change with a question mark, although that did not seem to be the predominant topic, and it would be hard to say what the actual predominant topic was. We always seem to approach things, we try to approach things from the perspective of what are the right questions to be asking on a given topic. Simone, I know you didn't have a chance to watch the entire episode, and I think that's the first question that I'd like to ask any of you that watch this would be, have you watched the full episode, which is nearly 2 hours? Simone, have you watched it?
No.
Okay. That's the first question. And I would stake a pretty good wager that most people that watch this and most people that are familiar, which is probably in the hundreds of millions of people that are familiar at this point with this interview, I would stake a large wager that the overwhelming majority of them have not watched the full episode, which merits the question, why not? And you should if you have the time.
I will say, though, if you can watch about 20 minutes of it, you'll get a really good taste of the insanity that takes place in that show.
Yes, and we could ask questions about how easy it is to sit and listen to some of the personalities that were there, but we won't digress into that. I will say this, in my humble opinion, there are people on the planet that have a laugh that are as cringe as Kamala Harris's, and I'm not sure exactly how that might factor into this particular conversation, but go watch the episode and see if you can apply that somewhere. The question that I'd like to ask viewers, what was the purpose of this? What was the purpose of this interview from the perspective of Tucker Carlson? What was Tucker trying to achieve? And Simone, based on the clips that you've seen on social media, what would you say is the answer to that?
Based on social media clips?
There are a few clips that are making the rounds.
It sounds like he wanted a lot of sound bites to make Ted Cruz sound like an absolute idiot. That's all I've seen. And then when you watch those questions actually unfold in the interview, it's like, wait a minute. Yeah, it's a lot different than the actual interview.
Do you think Tucker made Ted Cruz look like an idiot?
In the clips that they put out there, yeah.
Right.
But
in
the interview, no, he made himself look like an idiot.
So the public opinion, what do you think the public opinion would be if you were to ask, poll those that have watched the social media clips, not the full episode, if you were to poll them on, did Tucker Carlson make Ted Cruz look like a complete idiot? Would it be a yes or no?
Yes.
But I would agree with you that if you watch the entire episode, the contrary is absolutely the case. And if this were a debate, I would say that Ted Cruz overwhelmingly won this. So let's just talk about some of the particular issues. It's blatantly clear from this interview that Tucker Carlson contradicts himself constantly. Some of the things that came out that I think you might find of particular interest are, one, Tucker is one of the biggest critics today of the Iraq War, and I would be a critic of that myself. Also interesting to note, and it comes out very clearly in this interview, Tucker Carlson admits that he was one of the most outspoken journalists during that era on behalf of the Iraq War. So he absolutely believed in it and was outspoken on that. He doesn't get into the reasons why, but he admits that. So it's just something to note, okay, that this is a person with a history of going back and forth. And interestingly, conversely, Ted Cruz, for those of you America First people, Ted Cruz was absolutely and unequivocally against the Iraq War from start to finish. That does come out in this interview if you take the time to watch the whole thing. So those of you that are thinking Ted Cruz is not an America First guy, he was actually ahead of the game and ahead of the popular opinion at the time in being against the Iraq war. So that's just something to note for those that will never watch this.
Is it America first or America only?
That's a good question. I think that's one of the topics. That's one of the topics that comes up. And there's this very, very interesting exchange between Tucker and Ted. First of all, Tucker starts grilling Ted Cruz about AIPAC. And AIPAC is a very controversial topic in today's world. And from there, the conversation tends to migrate towards this fixation that Tucker Carlson has with Israel. Now, let me ask you a simple question, Simone. Does Tucker Carlson have a fixation with Israel?
Yes.
Okay.
Big time.
Israel is a country the size of New Jersey. Tucker is not Jewish. He's not Israeli, but it seems to dominate his news feeds. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I am not one of those people that calls people like Tucker out on anti-Semitism. In fact, I don't believe that Tucker is an anti-Semite. Might be a provocative statement for some of our audience, but it does merit the question, why? Why is he so fixated on Israel? And that really is the question that Ted Cruz poses to him. He said it's actually troubling that you're so fixated on Israel. And of course, Tucker starts rambling on and blaming Ted of accusing him and calling him an anti-Semite. A question that people that have watched the full episode should ask is, did Ted Cruz ever call Tucker Carlson an anti-Semite in that interview, the entire 2 hours? I'll answer it myself because, Simone, you haven't had the chance to watch the entire episode. And you can go out and just ask ChatGPT. The answer is no. In fact, quite the opposite. Ted Cruz never called Tucker an anti-Semite. And that's really, really important to, first of all, note because it comes up multiple times throughout the interview in a very, very shady way, okay?
Sounds like he has a little bit of a trigger there.
He has a trigger, and he even says that it's a trigger. He says when his feet are held to the fire over certain things he says throughout the interview, he falls back on that and says, well, I was just triggered because you're calling me an anti-Semite, which Ted Cruz never called him that. But that becomes his defense, and it's really, really interesting to watch and very, very perplexing because he's all riled up when he's the one that's going hard after AIPAC. Let's talk about AIPAC for a second because it's a very controversial thing. His point about AIPAC is that AIPAC is not registered as a foreign government lobby, which is true. It is not registered as one, and it denies that it is one. It is an American organization that lobbies on behalf of an interest that is an American interest. There are millions of Jews that live in America. They're not lobbying on behalf of a foreign government, okay? They're lobbying on behalf of the fact that they support Israel as Americans. That's their perspective. The audience can make whatever decision they want, but Ted addresses that clearly because Tucker's asking some very, very pointed questions about, do you ever talk to the Israeli government? Do people from AIPAC ever talk to the Israeli government? I mean, these crazy grilling questions. And it's actually troubling. And this is what leads up to Ted sort of asking him, why do you have such a fixation with Israel and with AIPAC? Like what's the deal here? If it's not anti-Semitism, he does ask the question, if it's not anti-Semitism, then please just explain what it is. It's a genuine question. I think it's a legitimate question. Why are you so fixated on this? And Tucker starts, sliding, getting uncomfortable, turning red in the face. Well, I'm not anti-Semitic and I support Israel.
Does he? Do you? Do you?
He almost says a couple times, I have lots of friends that are Jews, but he knows that you're not allowed to say that in response to these types of things anymore. So he catches himself. You could see it. Just watch it. It's really, really interesting. But I think there are some bigger questions to ask here. And I think it's important for the audience to know why Ted Cruz might be asking that question. So the way it works under the FARA agreement is if there is a foreign government that is lobbying on behalf of their country as a government, in the United States, they have to register with the United States government, okay, through FARA. And Israel does have their own lobby on behalf of Israel, the Israeli government, that is registered with FARA. And they spent, I believe, last year about $3.7 million or something to that tune. Very, very, very small lobby group. What's interesting to note, though, and I would encourage viewers to go out and check this out. So all the countries that are lobbying on behalf of their governments in the United States, they're registered with FARA. Israel isn't even in the top 10. So one might say, well, that's because they do their lobbying through AIPAC. I'm not gonna answer that question one way or the other. I just told you what AIPAC says. Even if you were to include the budget of AIPAC over the course of the last however many years, it's still not in the top 10. Okay? In fact, let's just take a look at the top 10. The number one. Who do you think, Simone? Who do you think's the number
Qatar.
one? Nope. It's not.
China.
China's the number one. Their spend between 2016 and 2024 was approximately $450 million in registered. That's what they registered with FARA. Okay. The second one, I'm just going to rip through them, is Japan. The third is Liberia. Fourth is South Korea. The fifth is Saudi Arabia. The sixth is the Marshall Islands. Interesting, huh? Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah,
Spending
but
a lot of money. Right, but doesn't really make the news much. Seventh is Qatar, of course. Eighth, United Arab Emirates. Ninth is the Bahamas. And the 10th is Bermuda. Go ahead, sing it.
Bahama.
So anyway, so those are the top 10 between 2016 and 2024. AIPAC, if I'm not mistaken, didn't even spend half of what those governments spent
Right.
over that course of time. Don't quote me on that, but look it up for yourself. And this is why Ted Cruz is asking Tucker this question: why the fixation on Israel? It would seem that the United States might have much bigger fish to fry than whatever's happening in Israel, one way or the other. When it comes to foreign influence in the United States, would you agree, Simone, that there are much bigger fish to fry than whatever influence the United States' self-proclaimed greatest ally is, Israel?
Yeah, like any of those top 10.
Right. So you don't hear Tucker Carlson talking a lot about Chinese influence in the United States, Japanese influence, Liberian influence, Saudi Arabian influence, or Qatari influence. Tucker, are you in any agreements with Qatar? Have they ever supported you? Well, not directly, through nonprofits. But why is Tucker constantly talking about Israel? Literally, it's dominating the newsfeed. And I think there are a number of reasons why. And I think we could ask the question in general, why, same with Dave Smith, why the fixation on Israel? And I have an opinion on it. What do you think? Why do you think they're doing that? I actually think there are a lot of well-meaning people that are buying into extraordinary levels of disinformation, misinformation, propaganda. But what do you think could be Tucker's? Why so fixated on Israel? He doesn't answer the question.
He's a Republican, right?
Yeah, he's a conservative.
Right. And, it's kind of a trend I've noticed with a lot of these far right people. They're starting to partner, I guess, with the far left. And I don't know, maybe it's a way to get a lot of influence and followers and all that. Who knows?
I think that's part of it. I don't know that I'd even say far left, right? But I think getting traction, getting followers, it's a very popular trend to begin to speak out today about this issue, okay, one way or the other. I think there are people that are building huge audiences, not to be too cynical, on both sides of this. But certainly with those people that seem to be dissenting from their prior perspectives, the Candace Owens of the world, the Tucker Carlsons of the world, who knows what Dave Smith ever thought, who cares? But why this seeming shift and pivot, I guess, would be the question, away from the traditional perspective. And it is a way, and if you look at the career trajectories of these two people, let's look at Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, pretty similar career trajectory. Both were sort of in a mainstream media position, both moved away from it, both had to build audiences on their own. And for that reason, you start to go after virality. And I think it's clear. Listen, I have a friend that lives here in rural Pennsylvania that really knows hardly anything about anything and started posting this type of content to an Instagram page and basically overnight grew an audience of 30,000 people. That's how viral this is. And if you're willing to be one of those voices that's saying these very controversial things, you can build an audience relatively quickly. Also, one might start to ask the questions and follow the money. Is there money in that? Okay, so when you're getting these tens and hundreds of millions of views of viral content, hey, certainly there is a value to that. Money plays a role. So I think one issue is the virality of the topic, and then also if you're willing to speak out against what has traditionally been the norm here in the United States on both sides of the aisle in terms of support for Israel, right? If you're willing to stand out and speak out against that, it certainly has a benefit to you from a virality perspective online. Now, the other obvious one that a lot of people are rushing to is they're getting paid to do this, right? And I can't, obviously I cannot say for certain, but I've done some small research on it. And certainly there is money that seems to have gone from Qatar to Tucker. There's this whole question of, did he receive a $15 million grant when he first started his show from Qatar? And we know that Qatar is buying up influence all around the world. That's not even a question. They're buying up news agencies, and they own more land in Great Britain than the royal family at this point. They own fashion brands, Valentino Balmain. They own Saint Germain soccer team, but they're just buying influence on every level that they possibly can. So would it be reasonable to think that they might also be investing in some of these media outlets that are more easily purchased, although they own linear mainstream media outlets, including Al Jazeera? Would you agree that Tucker seems to have a fixation with Israel that's a little bit abnormal, and even his fixation in this interview with AIPAC, and keeps coming back to this anti-Semitism falsehood where he's accusing Ted of calling him that when Ted Cruz never called him that? All of it's just a little bit weird if you watch the whole interview.
It was extremely aggressive.
Makes sense. It's very, very aggressive. And I have a theory on sort of this whole thing. I believe that as part of that system of driving virality, Tucker's entire goal for this interview was to create those few moments. He clearly trapped Ted Cruz on several questions. Where's that in the Bible? Right?
Right.
Expecting Ted to just rattle off chapter and
Ted's
verse.
like, I don't know, look it up. Like, who cares?
What's the population of Iran? Let me ask you a question for those of you rational thinkers out there. Do we think that Tucker might have, looked up the population of Iran right before this interview? If you listen and watch the entire interview, Ted keeps saying, we agree on 80% of things. Tucker agrees with that. We agree on 80% of things. There's a 10 or 20% that we don't agree on. But they seem to agree on just about everything. And then there are these inflammatory, explosive moments where Tucker is just absolutely rude and trying to trap him in these sound bites. And that's what you're seeing online. You do not see the other, yeah, I just said Nazi, horrible. But you really don't see the meat of this interview, this engagement. And
why?
I think it merits the question why. This, to me, was absolutely, unequivocally an ambush with a specific goal of creating those viral moments that Tucker went in to this to get. And I think that's demonstrated by the fact that that is what's going across social media. And I just encourage you to look at the numbers. Okay? When I last looked, it was at 1.6 million people, okay, have actually watched the full interview on YouTube. And when I looked just on Instagram alone, there were already over 30 million views of these little snippets. And that's on one social media platform. I would guess if you were to go across Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all the majors, TikTok, wherever, it's probably in the hundreds of millions of views of those small sound bites where Tucker is deliberately trying to make a fool of Ted Cruz. That was the point of this interview, as far as I'm concerned, because it seemed like that they went into this interview as friends. If you watch it, it seemed like even throughout the interview, even with the explosive nature of things, it seemed very friendly. Let me ask you, coming out of that on the other side, do you feel like the content that Tucker is posting on that interview is in a friendly spirit?
Not at all.
It doesn't seem very friendly. If I was Ted Cruz and I thought this guy was my friend going into it, and even maybe throughout it, even though they have some disagreements and heated arguments, do you think today, watching the news feeds and how Ted Cruz is being portrayed, do you think he's still friends with Tucker?
I would feel like, wow, this guy just went in there and intentionally sabotaged me. Like, just tried to make me look like an idiot. Why? Like, why would he do that to me?
Some of the sound bites that would be really, really interesting if someone else put out, Tucker Carlson, within a very, very short period of time, makes, some statements that he just doesn't believe in war. I just don't think we should be killing people. And again, I'm for a reductive approach to most things. And quite frankly, in general, I agree with that. Anyone who's for war, like who out there defines themselves as for war? I'm for war, in the Western world. And that's really important to point out. There's this narrative going around that there are these warmongers, and it's not to say there's no truth in it. Okay, based on the history. Okay, we understand that. But defining oneself as for war would be insane. So, okay, Tucker, so you're not for war, and I just don't think we should be killing people. Well, of course not, right? Of course you don't think that. Literally a few sentences later, they get into this another very bizarre exchange where Ted Cruz is saying that he has information from the intelligence community. There have been reports before Congress that Iran has sent assassins and mobilized assassins to try to kill President Trump. Now, Tucker questions the legitimacy of that, and even he says that Ted doesn't believe, you don't really believe that. You don't really believe that. He keeps saying it over and over and over again when Ted is saying, yeah, I absolutely believe it. And then he's saying, well, then why aren't we going to war? Why aren't you for war? And Ted's like, well, because first of all, they have no chance of actually succeeding is what he's essentially saying. He says they're not very good at it. It's bizarre throughout this whole interview. But then Tucker just keeps doubling down on this. And then he says, I don't believe that. And if I did believe it, I think we should nuke Iran tomorrow. Immediately. Like his literal words. If they're trying to kill the president of my country, I think we should nuke them.
Okay,
that seems
Mr.
a little bit
Anti-War.
inconsistent. Especially when you consider that the majority of Iranians are not in favor of this regime. And there are over 1 million Iranian expats in diaspora living here in the United States that overwhelmingly are cheering Israel on right now because they want the real freedom of their regime. And this would have been a great topic.
They want their country back.
What if this interview really would have been about regime change? Think about it. What if this interview would have really been about regime change, and should we be hoping for a regime change in Iran, which they do touch on it a little bit, right? And I would say that, there's look, Tucker doesn't make any sense throughout. He's really just there to stir the pot. You can't actually nail him to anything. Yeah, it would probably be good if there was a regime change, but we don't know if it would be better or worse. Look, all these things that, everyone always goes to in the Middle East, which, certainly can be true. You never know who's coming in after the next leader. And for that reason, also, there is a general understanding between leaders of nations that even in times of war, you're not necessarily trying to overthrow the regime, the government of another country. And there are a lot of reasons for that. We're not going to get into all that here. But it's been clearly stated by the United States that they're not trying to necessarily facilitate a regime change. So that's one inconsistency. Let's stay on point here. One inconsistency. He's against war, against killing, but if there is a plot by the government of Iran to kill his president, we should nuke Iran tomorrow. And Ted is like, that's a pretty extreme statement, all this stuff. And then Tucker starts falling back on this. Well, I was triggered. I was triggered because you called me an anti-Semite, which didn't even actually happen. It's literally, you've got to watch this. It's crazy. I support Israel. Okay, 100%. I wouldn't support anyone nuking Iran. That is an insane. You couldn't trigger me enough. Trigger me enough to get me to say we should nuke Iran tomorrow if they what an outlandish statement just in general. So
it just sounds pretty childish to be honest.
It's extremely childish.
The way that he was going after him and saying stuff like that, and it was so bizarre to watch.
It was, and then you have the situation. This should go viral. You have the situation where Ted is just asking, why are you so fixated with Israel? And Tucker starts saying, you're calling me an anti-Semite. And Ted's like, no, I'm not calling. Oh, you're calling. No, you're going to. And then he says, say it to my face. Why don't you say it to my face? These guys are sitting. If you look how close their legs are in the interview, they're almost touching. They're sitting 3 feet apart to fit them in frame. And Ted Cruz is just like, what? I just want everyone to know, I'm not here defending Ted Cruz. I felt bad for the guy. And then he basically says, I forget his exact words, you're acting like a sleazy feline. Whoa, oh, you cooked him, Tuck. They're not really very used words in today's world. I'm not really sure. But it's something like that. Sleazy feline, I don't know. Was Ted supposed to start meowing there? I really don't know. That was really bizarre. Who calls other people sleazy felines? And that's when Ted says, hey, maybe could we ratchet this down a little bit? This is getting really, really intense.
We should make that a band name.
Sleazy feline. That would be a really good
The
name,
sleazy
actually.
felines.
Yeah, and you could come out with like cat ears and like tails. The whole thing is very bizarre. And what happens from there is they waver in and out of these moments of just incredible tension and very inflammatory moments that are all essentially brought on by Tucker. And then Ted will sort of fight back. And literally twice he takes out a piece of paper, it's kind of funny, from his pocket to read Tucker's own words from his own newsletter. And this is when Tucker really goes ballistic. And every single time,
He
even
was
though they're not,
triggered, okay?
but even though they're not on topic, when he is confronted with his own words, for those of you in the audience, just watch his demeanor immediately change. He turns red and he immediately starts going to, happens twice, he starts going to, well, you called me an anti-Semite and that's what I'm against. I'm against people calling me and using that. And it's like, when he gets in a corner, he falls back on something that actually never happened. And I just want to tell you, as somebody of Jewish descent, that's troubling to me. Why are you going to this decree and undermining even the use of that word? We can all agree there are anti-Semites in the world. I don't think Ted Cruz or Tucker Carlson are anti-Semites, but to be using this type of rhetoric as the way that you slide out of being held accountable is troubling. And what it does is it could serve to certainly persuade. When you start telling people you're accusing me of something and they're not accusing you of it, but you have a massive following and a lot of people behind you, and you keep falling back and doubling down on this, I'm against you calling me this, do you think that you could potentially be undermining that word, that phrase, the legitimacy of being able to use that? And I believe it should be reserved for the real thing. And I do think it can be overused sometimes. Okay? But to be falling back on that in a situation like this is highly inappropriate and questionable to me. And it does merit some questions as why. Why do you keep falling back on this when it was never said in the first place?
Gaslighting 101.
Gaslighting 101. For those of you that might take an interest just in a broader scope, do some research on something called accusation in a mirror. Accusation in a mirror. I'm not going to say anything more about it here, but go take a look at it. It's something interesting to study, the use of it throughout history. So whenever he's sort of pinned in a corner by his own words, his own things that he published, they can be read, right? It's in his newsletter. He slides out of it with these blow-ups. And I think Ted is actually really confused by it, to be honest with you. I think he's just like, what? And he's an intelligent guy, right? So, and he also kept his cool. I don't know how he did it. So I guess it leads to just a greater question. We'll just kind of wind down here. If nothing more, for those of you that watch this, I recommend that you go out and watch the full interview and then ask yourselves, is this person, Tucker Carlson, somebody that I trust? Is this somebody that I trust his motives? Do I trust his history of decision making? Do I trust him in any way? Is there anything that just feels really weird about this interview? You should ask yourself that question. And here's a simple question. Do you think, Simone, that Ted Cruz was cooked by Tucker? That's what everyone's saying. You see these little media clips.
I
It's
mean,
like Ted was cooked by Tucker.
not in the sense that these people are saying it. I think that he had his own agenda. I think Tucker had his own agenda for this, and he was just using Ted Cruz as a way to garner support. And I think it's a way to, hey, it's like, hey, we're the same people, but now you like me because I got you to hate him even more.
Do you think that Ted Cruz cooked Tucker Carlson, or was even trying to?
No, I think he was just confused the entire time.
For anyone that would watch the entire interview, here's a question to ask, and I would ask you, Simone. Do you think Tucker Carlson was cooked by Tucker Carlson?
Yes.
I think so. I mean, you just watch it. Just watch it. He's absolutely does himself a huge disservice to anyone with any level of discernment and applying logic. Everything in this country is so inflammatory right now. We know that. Everything is so polarized. But, if you agree with someone on 80% of the issues, why would you bring them in and try to make a fool of them? There are so many questions to ask here just over this one issue. And of course, very little criticism of Iran from Tucker. So, let's not criticize this regime that is clearly the source of unrest in the Middle East. And even all of the moderate leaning Gulf states would agree with that. And many of them are actually working, whether overtly or covertly, with Israel to disarm and remove this nuclear capability from Iran, because none of them want to die in a nuclear war, okay? And they have what they call this Israeli mistress syndrome, where it's been going on for many, many years, where there's collaboration with Israel, and it's this thing that works well, serves an agenda, but you don't bring home to the family, so to speak, because of the ramifications across the Middle East. We know that there are also overt collaboration. There's overt collaboration that's taking place between Israel and countries like Jordan and Syria, who have opened up their airspace. Jordan's actively shooting down missiles and so on and so forth. Pretty unprecedented to think about that. And to me, that's actually hopeful. Just winding down, I think there's a lot of hope. And that's something that you don't hear much of today. But I think even in the Middle East, there's a lot of hope. And for people that don't see that and are telling a different story, I don't know why. But to me, the fact that there is deep collaboration between Israel, there are peace treaties between Israel and Egypt and Jordan, and there are, of course, the Abraham Accords, where there's actual partnership with some of these moderate-leaning states. There's so much movement in that direction in the Middle East that seems so positive to me. And I think once we get on the tail end of these wars and some of these radical factions that Israel is one by one eliminating, once they're out of the picture, I think that will pave the way towards peace. And I look forward to Israel not being in the news constantly, quite frankly, as an Israeli and so on of Jewish descent. But there seems to be an agenda to keep inflaming that, and we should be asking why.
Keep it sleazy.